energy access for green growth in Africa, how to bring development, green industrialization, and a just transition to life. That's a very big, bold thing to start the day on, but I know that's your passion. You've spent such an important amount of time working on this. Can you give us a sense of how investing in this area is producing results already? Because there are challenges, we know, but give us your overview.
I think it's important to start with the context. So currently on this continent, we have about 560 million people who have no access to electricity at all. And then we have about 900 million people who have access to no clean cooking. So we can't talk about energy transition when we don't talk about the basics of energy. It's also important to highlight that even when people have energy, they tend to have less than 200 kilowatt hours. I don't know where you live, if it's Europe or America, but the average person in Europe has 5,000 and the average American has 10,000. I'm bringing these things in context because you can't talk about economic growth or prosper without energy. So one of the things that we've been working a lot with countries on is that how do you make sure your energy, the energy you put on is green, cleaner, and how does that lead to economic growth? So how do you make sure you focused on powering SMEs who are really the heartbeat of the continent, powering farmers. And I know you're going to speak later on with my colleagues from AFDB and Nigerian government. There's a big program that's led by AFDB and African government and the World Bank called Mission 300, which is about powering 300 million Africans by 2030. And South Africa is actually part of that. But back to your question, it is just good maths really right now. We've seen with what is happening around the world that if you do not plan for the green energy transition, that economically by 2050, you won't be in the conversation anymore. So we work a lot with African governments here to say, what does it mean by to say net zero by 2050 and 2060? And it was quite amusing when the minister was talking, because I don't think the figures have been highlighted. So let me take my own country. Let me start from the hardest one, Nigeria, largest oil and gas nation. For Nigeria to transition by 2060, it will cost $1.9 trillion. And we have to say the figures and we have to say, what do they need to invest in? It's not just about, people think it's basic like stop oil and gas. It's not that. It's the fact that they need to get 100 million people out of poverty. They want to build an industrial base. They have to invest highly in transmission networks, in distribution networks, but also in transportation and the new way of building buildings. So I guess what we're trying to say is that let's look at the opportunities of energy transition. Let's look at the new jobs and how you transform systems instead of just focus on, I'm just going to give the basic level of energy to some household.
For sure. And certainly at The Economist, we have long argued energy is the master resource. Without it, development itself is not possible. And so the idea of just having one bulb is a good stepping stone. But surely Africa and the other parts of the developing world that are enjoying a demographic dividend should rightly have access to much greater energy for development. The challenge I want to put to you is that this is something that has been argued for quite a long time. This is not the first time we've seen this movie either. I can remember sitting in rooms 20 years ago with the World Bank and Rockefeller and African Development Bank and other worthies talking exactly about the same issue. And progress has been much slower than one would hope, particularly in Africa. India has made some progress. China has made much more progress. Can you give us a reflection on what has changed or what needs to change in the model of how the progress needs to be made in Africa?
So I think...
Has any lesson been learned?
Oh, absolutely. I think one of the key things, and I'm going back to my background, is the introduction of the private sector. So a lot of governments have focused on spending billions of dollars building out their grids, metering systems. Some of them even did solar mini grids, but it's failed in many cases because of the sustainability of it. So in Nigeria, about 5 years ago, we introduced something called the Nigerian Electrification Project, where we managed to connect 9 million people to solar plus storage solutions, but focused on the private sector doing that. So what Nigerian government did was they provide a resource-based subsidy at the end of the project, at the connection side. I think this model has now been done in many countries, but there is a difference when you let the private sector drive it. Obviously, you still regulate, you police, but the private sector has an incentive to keep on making money from this, but more important, providing a service. So that's changed things. I think Mission 300 has changed things as well. I mean, this is the first time we have the African Development Bank and the World Bank having such a bold target. And our role at Sustainable Energy for All and the UN system is to hold them to it. So we have literally meetings on Fridays, which Wale Shonibala will tell you about, tracking projects, knowing what projects, what is government's role, what is the permitting role, what is stopping things. I think another thing, and it's not just about Africa and African governments, is because it's Africa, this hasn't been taken as a priority like other continents, right? So, you can't say that, you want to power these things and government should find the money when government is in debt distress. So we need to realize and prioritize this energy access like we prioritize climate, like we're prioritizing the energy transition. And we have to understand that these are lives at stake here, like not having clean cooking is the fifth largest cause of death of an African woman today. These are real things that affects real people. This affects refugees turning up at your shores when people do not have access to the basic energy that keep them going. So you can't kind of take the economic side or take, they're just poor people over here. They do have a larger social effect around the world, really.
And as you rightly say, the impact on women and girls is much more potent, as it's often women and girls who go and get the informal fuels that in energy poverty, losing hours of potential work or school that they could otherwise do. And the indoor pollution disproportionately affects women, which is one of the biggest killers. The goals that you talked about at Mission 300, for those who are not familiar, could you elucidate the goals? I understand it's to electrify 45% of the population, but maybe you could speak a little bit more about the ambition that you mentioned.
So the ambition is to provide electricity to 300 million Africans, but the ambition is also going a little bit further. It's to have kind of like a green value chain and really look at the role of the utilities, really look at green jobs or sustainable jobs as you go along, and to make sure that the private sector are firmly in this conversation. I know you're going to have, like I said earlier, Wale at the African Development Bank, who's really, really been driving also the need for African money and local currency financing. We're finding in a lot of cases where projects are funded in hard currency, where there's a devaluation, which there will be in many of our countries, unfortunately, the projects fail. So there's nothing technically wrong with them. They fail because of the way they were funded. Mm-hmm. So there's a big push by him and many of us to start including our pension funds, our banks, and understanding what risk mitigation they need to really, really strive. We cannot do these programs alone on hard currency. It just doesn't work. And a lot of countries have never built out their whole infrastructure, especially their energy infrastructure, based on hard currency.
Do you see any innovative hedging instruments or tools that can help at the level of the micro entrepreneur or the individual householder? Because as you say, both the forex risk of the dollar risk as well as the interest rates that prevail in Africa are huge impediments to this investment effort.
I mean, I think one step further, I will go in terms of, for this project to work, we need 20 times more developers, or we need to scale up our developers 20x, which is a huge opportunity for what happens to the African developer. And I'm going to spend like literally 30 seconds on this. Right now, the African developer is borrowing money at 20 to 30%. While the foreign developers doing the same projects have the luxury of maybe getting 2-3% money, have raised the greatest Series A, Series B, because they understand that market. So one of the things we're focused on, again, working with the AFDB and part of my government, in Nigerian government, is that what do we do? How can we invest in African developers by putting in equity? So we are raising a fund with the Nigerian Sovereign Investment Authority. This is the first time, a sovereign wealth authority in Africa is putting money into this. and Africa 50 and say, look, how are we going to build up our developers so they're not perpetual subcontractors to the international developers? I want to stress, I am not saying we do not need international developers, we do. But if you have 80% of the grants giving out by African governments only going to foreign developers, that doesn't work for the system. There needs to be some wealth creation, and people need to know that the money is actually kept in country and the jobs are created in country as well.
Well, that deserves a round of applause, 100%. A lot of the technology, though, it must be noted, does come from China, right? The solar revolution has played a huge role in enabling the advance of clean energy. How do you see that challenge in a world of deglobalization and tariffs and something of a China backlash in certain parts of the world? How do you see the impact here in Africa where you're trying to have impact?
I haven't seen the impact for the backlash because there isn't an alternative right now to China. To be perfectly honest, what we're trying to do is kind of maximize on that in this situation. So in the last maybe 3 years, there's been about 10 solar panel assembly facilities, 3 of them manufacturing on the continent. We're trying to push the need for 2-3-wheelers to be manufactured on the continent. We are not there yet with battery storage and batteries, but we're looking at it, and we're also looking at what is the role in critical minerals. What kind of, first stage production can be done on continent before things are sent out. So there are different areas. So we're looking at the opportunities of these things and how the Chinese and the Indians and some other countries that have come to different parts of Africa, how they can do some of the production in-house. And Femi Akinolure from the Nigerian government, he's going to speak about how he's insisting that anybody who is doing any types of solar projects in Nigeria, they set up based in Nigeria. So there's an the OEM is in the country. So when something goes wrong, you're not spending 9 months sending your panels off somewhere and disrupting the whole work. All of these are stepping stones for us building our own green value chains where we can start hopefully producing a lot of these things in Africa in the next few years.
Well, that's a perfect setup for where we're going to next with this conversation, that is to bring on some of the experts that you've mentioned and practitioners. So I'm going to ask if we can stand up with me. Let's give her a round of applause for the good opening comments. But